Well, good morning, everybody. I'm really sorry I can't be with you today in church. Don't worry, Pauline and I have only got colds. Our lateral flow tests are nice and negative, but we just didn't think you'd appreciate me coughing and spluttering over you. And I'm going to find it easier to record the sermon in a way that I can edit out those little interruptions. Um, but thank you to Jenny for leading the service this morning. That was scheduled anyway, which is convenient. Anyway, we come to the end of our series in Nehemiah. And last week, in my capacity as chair for Churches Together in Windsor, I had a few emails from the person who was organising Friday's Carols on the Hill event outside Windsor Castle. Now, she was tying up some loose ends to make sure that the event ran smoothly. Things like arrangements for readers, for the band, and for stewards and bucket collectors, all of which, if left undone, could cause absolute chaos on the night. Actually, I turned out to be one of the last loose ends myself, because at short notice I had to pull out of doing a reading. Thankfully, she found someone else to cover for me, and everything fell into place after having sadly been cancelled last year. Now, as we reach the end of this fascinating Old Testament story, we find Nehemiah effectively tying up some loose ends himself. Not in the rebuilding of the walls and the city that he'd been doing, but in the rebuilding of Israel as the people of God. Before we say anything else, we need to be clear that the passage that we've heard is a story of its time, and that it cannot be applied to today's church in such a way that justifies a policy of what, on the face of it, appears to be uncomfortably similar to apartheid. This has got far more to do with our identity as God's people, and with the values that go with our precious calling, than it does with race or nationality. After all, it's our diversity of race and nationality that today makes up so much of the richness of 21st century Christian culture. So, what are the issues that Nehemiah faced on his return to Jerusalem some time after completing the city walls? What are the loose ends that he had to tie up? What did he have to do to effectively put Israel back on track? And how might these lessons apply to us today? Well, if we read the chapter as a whole, and we didn't read all of it, we find that there is a physical dimension to it in the part that we read, which is about restoring to God his rightful place in Israel. Then there's a temporal dimension, which is about restoring God's rightful time in their pattern of life. And finally, there's a spiritual dimension, which is about restoring Israel as his rightful people in relationship with him. So verses 1 to 14 show us that the first loose end that Nehemiah discovered arose from the fact that the assembly of God had become infiltrated with unbelievers. Not those who were seeking to find faith or who were sympathetic to and cooperative with God's values and ways, but those who had obstructed God's people both in the distant past, as he recounts the story of Balaam from the book of Numbers, and in the recent past, as he reminds them of what Tobiah the Ammonite did to get in his way when he was trying to rebuild the walls. More worryingly, that recent problem had happened under the direct oversight of someone whose responsibility it was to protect Israel's relationship with God. When Eliashib the priest rented out the temple storerooms for personal use by his friend Tobiah, who as an Ammonite was one of the people who should not even have been there, and as I say, he was one of Nehemiah's arch enemies at the start of the book. When Eliashib did that, he deprived the Levites and musicians responsible for maintaining the worship of God in the temple of their living. because there was nowhere to store the tithes and offerings upon which they lived. Those offerings dried up, and we read in verse 10 that the provision that should have been made for them simply wasn't made. They had to find ways of living off the land instead. Now, Nehemiah's reaction in throwing Tobiah's possessions out of the temple, doesn't that remind you a bit of Jesus' righteous anger in turning over the moneylenders' tables when they set up store in the temple grounds in his day? To coin a modern phrase, Nehemiah called it out. He challenged the officials. He said they were neglecting the house of God, the place that provides a focus for their worship as a community. Without that, and without the service of the Levites and musicians, the whole community's focus was taken off God. This was therefore about neglecting the worship of God. Their worship of God had been derailed, and Nehemiah did what was necessary to put it back on track. For Israel, this was about restoring the physical place that facilitated their worship of God and restoring material provision for the people who made that happen. Those of you who have been here at Dedworth for more than 12 years or so know what it's like to have to restore the place of worship after a period without a building to call your own. So I guess the challenge for us is, when we moved back in, did the rebuilding of this church facilitate our worship of God, or did the church building become a distraction? And today, are we maintaining the building and supporting the people who help us to use it in ways that bring us closer to God? I'll leave you to answer those questions. They may be different answers for different people. But that's the first loose end, which addressed the need to provide for the physical aspect of their worship, both in terms of a venue and in terms of providing for the people who ran it. The second loose end, which we find in verses 15 to 22, addresses a temporal issue. The issue of restoring time for God in the midst of their busy lives. Their Sabbath, sunset on Friday to sunset on Saturday, was being treated like any other day, with business being conducted 7 days a week. Again, Nehemiah calls out the leaders. Verse 17, I rebuked the nobles of Judah and said to them, what is this wicked thing you're doing, desecrating the Sabbath day? Again, we need to be careful not to use a passage like this to become legalistic about our approach to Sundays. After all, Jesus defended his disciples when they broke Sabbath laws to gather grain to eat. And Paul, writing in Romans 14, says, one person considers one day more sacred than another. Another considers every day alike. Each of them should be fully convinced in their own mind. What I find interesting in this part of the story is Nehemiah's statement that they were desecrating the Sabbath day. One commentator points out that desecrating means turning what is sacred into common use and so profaning it. It's the opposite of consecrating. The challenge for us is whether we treat all days alike or one day as special. Do we set apart time for God, whether it's on a daily or a weekly or a seasonal basis or an annual basis, hopefully on more than those? Do we have time that is consecrated, sacred, because it is our time to connect with God and rediscover his plans and purposes for us? As I say, that might be a daily quiet time. It might be a regular time to pray with a close friend once a week. It might be the day that you meet with God's people to worship him. It might be something else, or all of these things. Of course, the other half of the challenge is to recognize how easy it is to desecrate that time and to put it to common use, whether that's watching the TV or getting on with some work or whatever it is. On reflection, one of the times that are consecrated for Pauline and me is our holidays, when we get the chance to reconnect not only with God, but with each other. It's easy to desecrate them with the very best of intentions. I did that last year, when the only time that could be found for interviews of new food share managers was one evening in the middle of our summer holiday. And against my better judgment, don't worry, we didn't come home, but against my better judgment, I spent the evening on Zoom helping to interview 4 candidates for 3 posts. It didn't wreck the holiday, but in a small way, it desecrated part of it. So, what are your sacred times with God? In what ways can they be easily desecrated? And like Nehemiah, what can you do to restore those times for God? The third and final loose end that Nehemiah ties up in this chapter is arguably a spiritual one, because it's about restoring Israel's true identity as the children of God. In their case, we find in verses 23 to 29 that intermarriage with unbelieving nations had become a stumbling block for Israel, because their children were being brought up learning other languages and therefore unable to engage with the worship of God in their own language. The people were losing their identity as God's children. Again, I don't think this sort of passage should be misused to criticize those of us who have married non-Christians or who have family members who have done so. After all, Paul, writing to the Corinthian church, declares that the unbelieving husband has been sanctified through his wife, and the unbelieving wife has been sanctified through her believing husband. Otherwise, your children would be unclean. But as it is, they are holy. That's interesting, because holy or set apart for God is something that the children of mixed marriages in Israel were not. But we do need to be careful about our relationships, whether with Christians or non-Christians. We need to be careful that they help us to deepen our identity as God's children rather than hindering our growth. I can tell you from experience that not every relationship with a Christian will help you draw closer to God. Equally, not every relationship with a non-Christian will drive you further from God. So we need to be wise and discerning, seeking the partnership and counsel of those who are supportive of our values and faith in whatever area of life we seek partnership. In Nehemiah's day, his response to the problem did look rather harsh in its outworking. Verse 25, I rebuked them, I called curses down on them, I beat some of the men and pulled out their hair. I made them take an oath in God's name and said, you are not to give your daughters in marriage to their sons, nor are you to take their daughters in marriage for your sons or for yourselves. That's all rather uncompromising and very much of its time, but done with the motive to restore Israel's identity as a people set apart for God, a holy people. But as I say, notice in the verse from Corinthians that I mentioned a moment ago, that even if we don't fully understand the context of that passage that Paul was writing, there's the clear suggestion that our faith in Jesus is now what makes our children holy, and it's what makes us holy. Our faith in Jesus is what gives us our identity as God's children. Nehemiah went on to purify the priests and the Levites, to make them holy again, to assign tasks to them and to provide what they needed to undertake those tasks. But it's his closing prayer that I want to focus on in finishing. After describing what he did to tie up each of these loose ends, Nehemiah prayed each time, and the prayer was practically the same each time. Verse 14, remember me for this, my God, and do not blot out what I have so faithfully done for the house of my God and its services. Verse 22, after challenging the Sabbath breaking, remember me for this also, my God, and show mercy to me according to your great love. And verse 31, after challenging their loss of identity, remember me with favour, my God. That final prayer has echoes of the Advent and Christmas story of Jesus' conception and birth. Remember the angel's greeting to Mary? Greetings, you who are highly favoured. The Lord is with you. And do not be afraid, Mary. You have found favour with God. You will conceive and give birth to a son, and you are to call him Jesus. You'll find that in Luke 1, verses 28 and 30 to 31. And then in the very next chapter, verse 14, Elizabeth's greeting to Mary. But why am I so favoured that the mother of my Lord should come to me? And for that matter, the angelic greeting to the shepherds. Sorry, it's the angelic greeting that's in Luke 2:14. Elizabeth's greetings back in Luke 1. The angelic greeting to the shepherds. Glory to God in the highest heaven, and on earth peace to those on whom his favour rests. And then remember that at the very start of Jesus' own ministry, he said that he came to proclaim the year of the Lord's favour. God's favour is found in the gift of his Son, Jesus. It's through faith in him that we can tie up our loose ends as we seek to set aside a place and a time to worship God. And it's in relationship with him that we discover our true identity as God's children. It's only in relationship with Jesus that our lives are truly rebuilt and restored to the way they ought to be. And so at Christmas, we realize that God has answered Nehemiah's prayer and remembered us with favour. Amen.